An interest rate cut may have given Chancellor Rachel Reeves a little respite this week, but an independent economic report suggests that she has a £50 billion hole to fill if she's to hit her own fiscal targets. What options does she have? On the international stage, the grotesque scenes in Gaza continue, with Israeli President Netanyahu promising an escalation of activities, whilst Donald Trump is set to meet Vladimir Putin this week in Alaska. Is a deal to end the Ukraine conflict in sight? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
So welcome back to the Den, and before Jim, Joe and myself get stuck into those subjects, let me tell you of a very exciting podcast which will be published tomorrow. I did a 90-minute interview with the wonderful Dame Louise Ellman earlier last week, and she and I talked all things Lancashire County Council, of which she was the leader for 16 years. We also talked about her career in Parliament. She, of course, went on from the County Council to be the MP for Liverpool Riverside. And she was, I think it's fair to say, one of, if not the most influential local government leader of her time. So a fascinating podcast. And as I say, that will be out for your pleasure to listen to from tomorrow. So, Joe, Jim, lovely to see you again. And are we enjoying the warm weather, Joe, and taking to the sea to have your many, many swims?
I am taking to the sea, and it is 19 degrees in the sea, and it is crystal clear and absolutely lovely. I would, as a gardener, like some nice gentle overnight rain, because it is dry as bloody concrete, and I've already been up to my allotment this morning, but we don't want to go down the path of allotments because we did that last week.
And James, have you had a good week?
Yes, in sunny Cornwall. But this warm seas is causing a problem, though, because it's caused a plague of octopuses, and they eat the crabs upon which our living depends. So in order to provide you scousers with crab meat, so a bit of a crisis, but still we mustn't knock this lovely weather.
Well, I was on Saturday at Everton's new stadium, Bramley Moor Dock, which is an absolutely incredible facility. I have to say it's, if not the best stadium in Europe, certainly the best stadium in the UK by a country mile. It's an absolutely incredible place, and what Everton now need to do, of course, is get a team that is good enough to grace the stadium. I watched in frustration as we fell to a 1-0 defeat to Roma, but there was some consolation yesterday as Crystal Palace walked away with the Charity Shield, beating Liverpool on penalties. I'm not a bitter blue at all, James. Anyway, if my problems with Everton Football Club are concerning and keeping me awake at night, I'm sure it pales into insignificance when Rachel Reeves is trying to come up with a budget, an autumn budget, that will begin to get our economy back on track. She apparently faces, depends which economic report you read, I suppose, but certainly a 40 to 50 billion pound black hole if she's to meet her own fiscal targets. And people are from across the political spectrum giving her advice as to how she may fill that hole. So from everything for welfare cuts, as far as Jeremy Hunt is concerned, that's where the big money is to be found, through to taxes on gambling casinos. And that's a piece of advice that she's been given from the former Chancellor, former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. So where does she go, Joe? Because clearly there is a gap in terms of the cash that she requires. My guess is that she'll be looking at a combination, actually, of some tax increases, but also some further cuts in public sector budgets.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine she's lying on a sun lounger, sitting back with a Jilly Cooper, thinking everything's lovely and sunny. I thought Gordon Brown, in his interview and his articles last week, was very interesting, and he really did. He brought in the triple lock, and he didn't say it should go, but he said times have changed, and I think that is something that she's got to look at very quickly and bite the bullet and do it, because one of the problems I think with the economy is that yes, there's this huge hole, and she can't now blame that on the Conservatives. I mean, that is other external factors, and of course Brexit, but nobody will ever admit that, but there are other things that she could be looking at, like, and people have been saying this for years, a revaluation of the council tax bands, the nonsense that allows student landlords to not pay council tax, when actually you could argue that in many student towns and cities, it's the rented properties that put the biggest strain on the refuse collectors and everything else. She can't keep fiddling around and getting it wrong. You've either got to go hard and cut, and if that means triple lock ends, then bite the bullet and be done with it. Property, I think, is the other thing that is a real big problem. And it is this thing that you've got an awful lot of people who are not only getting a triple lock pension, they are asset property rich. And you've got young people who can't even get rented accommodation, never mind buy their own homes. So you've got this terrible discrepancy and this terrible inequality on property ownership. And property is where there is money to be brought into the Treasury coffers, I think. And as you said last week, Frank, you could be looking at VAT on everything. Why do we keep the fuel duty frozen? Why? There are lots of ways to do it, but she's got to be firm and hard and do something that doesn't appear to attack one particular group of people, I think.
I think the other problem that she's got, Jim, is that we continually having these conversations of what the Chancellor will do next. And of course, that's no good for the markets. It's no good for business, because people like certainty. They want to know what the roadmap is. And so there is talk of her pushing the budget back to November. I think that would be a mistake. It was a mistake when the government first came into power to wait 4 months to introduce the first budget, because that then allowed all sorts of speculation to take place and frit some of the markets, slowed the economy down without question. And of course, she talked down UK PLC as well during that period of time, which further depressed people's confidence. So my view is that she should be going early, and she should be going bold, and she should be coming up with a series of measures which then enable her to draw a line and move on, so that over the subsequent 3 years that she has left as Chancellor, we assume, if Keir Starmer is to be believed and Rachel Reeves is to be with us as Chancellor for the entirety of this Parliament, she can then be on a little more firmer footing. But it's a hell of a mess that partly, yes, she's inherited, but partly it has to be said of her own making as well. As an example, the national insurance changes that she's made are likely certainly not to bring her any more cash into the Treasury, potentially less, because of course employers are now cutting back on staff, and indeed hiring is starting to decrease as well. So she's got this problem, Jim. Where are the sort of areas that you'd be suggesting to her she should be looking at?
Well, I think you're right on timing. I think there should be a budget almost immediately after the party conference recess. So we're talking about the middle of October. Last year, I think it was on the 30th of October, but you're absolutely right. This debilitating speculation is just depressing the economy even further. And you've given the evidence of how employers are reacting. They want some degree of certainty about this. So the sooner this budget takes place, the better. I also think that Jo makes a really good point in terms of whatever she does. She wants to try and avoid martyr farmers, martyr disabled people, because they've been able to identify with the public to some extent over particular proposals that have been made. So we need more general solutions to this. I think the triple lock comes into play. I think fuel duty is a complete anomaly in this situation, particularly because spot price for petrol is actually low at the moment. So, when I last bought it was about 133, 135 instead of being 148 a litre. So that's an obvious one. And of course, the big one would be VAT. I mean, but obviously we know that this would be a breach with the triple promise that was made. But, if she's going to set a path for the rest of this parliament in closing this £50 billion gap, then something pretty drastic has got to be done. Gordon Brown, of course, is convinced that the two-child limit is the way to do it. He mounts a powerful argument, as he always does, because he says that child poverty then leads on to pressures on health and education and skills, and therefore we're paying a hidden price for having the two-child benefit. I still personally, who cares what I say, but I still personally resist it. I think, it was a way of managing family economies, but I know I'm getting into controversial territory here, but that's what Gordon Brown suggests. Another big one, which is quite interesting, I run past you, is the question of defence, because to be fair to Rachel Reeves, the thing that's really hoved into view since the general election is defence spending, this requirement to try and edge up to 5%. And the suggestion that the European countries of NATO sort of pool the cost of increasing their budgets, and therefore it would take it off the UK's books. I'm not an expert on how exactly that would be done, but perhaps there's some imaginative ways of getting out of this bind that she's in with the financing of the country. But you're absolutely right. This continued speculation is going to mean a summer and early autumn of continued very slow growth, in my opinion.
Yeah, and in terms of the narrative that she starts to create over the coming weeks and months, it's got to be about those new challenges. As Joe said, the 22 black hole story has long since disappeared into the rear view mirror. She's not going to be able to use that as any sort of excuse moving forward. But of course, what she can say with absolute justification is that the combination of Donald Trump and his tariffs, and of course this need to find a huge amount of cash for defence, does mean that she needs to change course. And why that hasn't been done sooner, we're all scratching our heads as far as that's concerned. But those are the sort of things that she needs to be saying very clearly to the country, Joe. And of course, we've been saying for some time now, and you see this commentary increasingly in the broadsheets at least, politicians have to start at some point basically coming clean with the British public. You can't have investment in the NHS, investment in infrastructure, investment in defence, investment in education without finding the money from somewhere. And that means tax increases, changes to the money that we're currently spending. Pensioners and welfare bills are the two that you would have to look at and say there's money to be found there. I guess the NHS would fall into that category as well, but it seems to me that Wes Streeting at least is on with trying to come up with some reforms and some changes as far as the National Health Service is concerned. But we look at this situation that Rachel Reeves is in and we say, wow, that's tough, that's challenging. But she does have lots of levers to pull if only she would be brave enough to pull them, Joe. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right, Frank. And I think for too many years, generations, politicians have not been honest. Tony Blair had it easy to a large extent when he came in 97. Everything went tits up in 2008 with the global financial crash. And we are really still in the aftermath of that. And lots of people have got very rich, lots of people have got very poor. And we've got different leadership, a whole shift in the sort of global economy. I mean, one of the other things that I thought was interesting that Gordon Brown said, Mr. Prudence himself talked about what Germany's done and how they've relaxed the rules and changed the rules slightly so that they can meet the huge requirements of an increased defence budget. And he was sort of intimating that that's something that Rachel Reeves could do. And, there is a point when you actually you can keep whinging and whining, but it's a bit like a school teacher or an employer, as you very well know, being one. At a certain point, you have to say, right, have you got any better ideas? No, this is how it's going to be, and we're going to get on with it. And if you don't like it, that's fine. You've got to be brave if you're going to be honest, but you can't keep promising everything without saying how you're going to pay for it. So, be tough, be brutal, but this time get it right. Don't be forced into a U-turn. I mean, she'd be far better off to increase the inheritance tax threshold on the farming families because, we need food security. Put it up to 2 million. That's all you need to do. At least you look like you're listening. Cut benefits where they need to be cut, but introduce the methods by which you can do that. As we've said before, face-to-face interviews instead of online applications. Have a look at council tax rebranding and make that a priority, and think about triple lock. And then, look at all the other things that we've discussed, but do it properly and be prepared. Get some people round who actually walk the streets and talk to people, and not the people that you've identified so articulately over the last few months, Frank, the slightly lily-livered new MPs who are frightened by 10 emails.
And they're the people who Rachel Reeves's team are blaming Jim for this mess that the Chancellor finds herself, because they're saying that was the thing, the welfare revolt, that has started to unravel her plans moving forward. And to an extent, we can accept that. But we're talking about a cut of 5 billion over the course of the Parliament. That probably would have been more, of course, but nevertheless, she'd have still been facing some major challenges. Take the welfare costs aside. And for me, she wasn't bold enough in terms of the reform and the changes that she wanted to make to welfare. They need to crack on with that. They can't just park that and say, OK, we've had a revolt, so we can't look at that again, because this bill is ballooning to the tune of £390 billion by the time we get to 2030 if nothing is done about it. So welfare should be on the agenda, absolutely. But as I say, Jim, I'm not sure whether internal Labour Party politics I'm talking about now, she's going to get away with saying to the PLP, well, it's all your fault for not allowing me to cut that £5 billion out of the budget.
Yeah, but we touched on this last week, that it was obviously a huge intake of new Labour MPs who are not used to sort of getting hostile emails. And I just look at the list we've discussed this morning. How are those new inexperienced Labour MPs going to react to a change in the triple lock, motorists getting angry about fuel duty increases, everybody getting angry about VAT increases? There is a political calculation here. I mean, obviously, during the course of the summer, some of those backbench MPs who have revolted over welfare reforms will have had time to reflect on their behaviour and to have listened to this argument that if they don't support the government, they're going to certainly be one-term MPs. And maybe they'll become more loyal. On the other hand, there's a view that because an awful lot of them are going to be one-term MPs because the Labour empire is stretched to its ultimate boundaries at the moment, that they actually think we are going to do what our principles tell us to do, and if we defeat the government or circumscribe the Chancellor, then so be it. So that is a big question. Of course, the Conservatives will want to make capital out of this. And just a quick word, slight digression. I don't know if you saw Kemi Badenoch's interview with Amal Rajan on BBC Two last Thursday. I mean, it's made headlines because she snitched on a person who was cheating her exams. But to be fair, in the longer form interview, she came over quite well, and she's being criticised for that. But I think, the Conservatives are probably in slightly better mood at the moment and will be ready to pounce on all this. But of course, the challenge to Reform and the Conservatives will be, well, what would you do? Final thing I want to say is about interest rates, because very important for mortgages. The vote was very tight on the cut last week. And I think as we're discussing the economy, we need to factor that in, that there may not be any more, they want to get down to 3%, but it could be a very slow path, which also informs what we're talking about.
Yeah, the interest rate cut is something that was good news, of course, for the Chancellor for the economy. Not, of course, if you're a saver. We always talk about interest rate cuts as being this fantastic thing. But, of course, if you saving cash, then it's not so great news. But nonetheless, in the big scheme of things, interest rate cuts are always seen as good news. But you're right, Jim. Looks like we will not see another cut for some considerable time, if that vote is anything to go by, unless something dramatically changes. Yeah, let's touch on Kemi Badenoch. I mean, I didn't see the interview, so I can't comment on whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. But what I have to say is, she must have the same sort of advisors as the government have had in terms of looking for a headline that's going to be used, and sadly used against her in this case, because the idea that as a 14, 15-year-old kid, you're going to snitch on your mate and celebrate the fact that you got them expelled from school seems to be a bizarre notion. And I don't think it's just a Liverpool thing. I mean, my kids were absolutely they said, what a disgrace, what an absolute, I won't use the language they used, but it was seen as, it's just something that nice people don't do. So I don't know, Jim, it might have been a good interview, but she blew it with that one story, and she's also doubled down on it since, hasn't she? She said, oh, well, if you do the wrong thing, then as far as I'm concerned, well, good luck with that message to the British electors. I don't think she's going to be here after next May anyway, so I think it's irrelevant in terms of what Kemi Badenoch does. The number of people who in the Conservative Party have said to me she's an absolute waste of space and she's toast, I've lost count of. So I don't think it's particularly relevant, but be interested to get your views, Joe, in terms of... Well,
can I come in first? Because I absolutely...
In your media training, Jim, your media training, would you ever have said to a politician, go on to a mainstream program for an hour, and what you want from the headline that you're looking for is Kemi the snitch? That's what you want to get out of this interview, because that's what she ended up with, Jim.
Kemi, the upholder of honest standards. It is not right to cheat in exams. And it is very interesting. I'm sure your children represent the majority view in this country, but it's a comment on where we've got to in this country. The fact is, it's wrong to cheat. Come on,
Jim. We're not talking about somebody who's like bashing someone over the head and robbing a mobile phone or a handbag. We're talking about a kid who is cheated on an exam. Okay, fair enough. But for another child to go, hey, miss, he's cheating, and then to celebrate the fact that he got expelled. So my narrative would have been, no, she did, Jim. So my narrative would have been, well, I spotted somebody was cheating at an exam and I informed the teacher. Exactly. I was mortified that it led to that child being expelled because I think that was a bit of an over-the-top response.
I agree with the latter.
She'd have got away with that, but come on. To be saying, and they got expelled, isn't that great?
No, I don't. Are you sure she said that? Because,
he got expelled and it was great. That was fantastic because basically, and if it happened now, I'd do it again. It's nuts.
She also managed to, annoy quite a lot of people who have got Christian faith, saying she didn't believe in God anymore. So you say, okay, I'm a snitch and I'm an atheist. What do you not like about me? And I don't like sandwiches. I mean, the woman is deranged. And I can only assume that somebody like Alistair Campbell is media training her, because she clearly hasn't got anyone on her own side. I mean, it makes Theresa May running through the wheat fields look positively lyrical. She comes across as hard, brittle, disinterested and lazy. And I frankly couldn't give a damn what she says, because I completely agree with Frank. She won't be here after next May. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if she's gone at the conference. But they don't want to, Cleverly's back on manoeuvres. He's back on the front bench. Jenrick's now, ramping up the I can be more like Nigel Farage than Nigel Farage. And actually saying, well, I really fear for my daughters, publishing their photographs in national newspapers. So we all know what they look like. Hello. But I think they're going to be raped by anybody with brown skin. I mean, for God's sake, There is nobody in the Conservative Party that speaks out frequently who has got any grain of credibility as a human being.
I do fear, I mean, I was going to do this next week and we will a bit more detail, but I do fear for the Conservative brand, genuinely, because I don't think it does our politics in this country any good whatsoever for the opposition to be in as much disarray as it is. And I take your point, Jim. Mel Stride made a statement this week about, you know, and again, go back to that point. Well, what would you do, Mr. Stride? Well, I wouldn't start from here. Well, Rachel Reeves could say exactly the same. That's no answer whatsoever. You know, they've got to start at some point coming up with some alternative solutions to the problems that we find ourselves. But the Conservative brand at this moment in time is a busted flush. I mean, they're hovering around 15% in some polls. Reform, meanwhile, are 30%, and are hoovering up Conservative voters. I was going to say left, right, and centre, but of course it's right, right, and right. And Badenoch isn't helping, but she's not the only problem that the Conservatives have. I just think that they have, you know, Liz Truss. They've never really recovered. If you look at the polling since Truss's premiership, they've never really recovered from that, and it's just getting worse for them. But now it'll be interesting to see whether or not Joe or Jim get more work from media training over the next few months, given the response that they had to that Badenoch interview, because Jim seems to be quite comfortable with Kemi. So, as I say, we'll get into a bit more detail.
Maybe he did the training, Frank. Maybe he just doesn't want to, you know, client confidentiality and all that.
Yeah, no time for cheaters.
We'll get into the Conservatives' trials and tribulations next week, but I think that line, the line of the day, I'm sure we'll clip this up, is I'm a snitch, I'm an atheist, and I don't like sandwiches, vote for me. I think that sums up the leader of the opposition's campaign messaging at the moment. Let's get back on track and back to the subject of the Chancellor then and Rachel Reeves. And in normal times, of course, I think the Labour Party would be sitting pretty, wouldn't they? In terms of the opposition being in even more disarray than the government is. But of course, you have got this big surge of reform support, and then you've got the spectre of a new party on the left, led by Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. Again, interesting polling as far as that's concerned, guys. Get your reaction to this. Apparently, that new left party, your party, as it's called at the moment, I think they're going to change that name, but they're taking support not from Labour, but from the Greens. So that's a sort of interesting development, Jim, isn't it?
Yes, the Greens are currently engaged in a leadership election where the existing, I'm bad on the names here, but the existing co-leader is standing against a much more radical opponent who believes that the Greens should be more proactive on issues like Gaza, trans rights, as well as obviously on the environment. And obviously that shows a feeling within the Green Party that they have got competition from the Corbyn Party and need to be more radical. They need to be careful. I mean, we don't often sort of examine the internal politics of the Greens, but they need to be careful because they obviously attract a broad spectrum of support. An awful lot of people who care about the countryside, you know, traditional Greens care about the countryside and are less turned on by trans rights and things like that. So they need to be careful in that respect. But there's clearly a view that Carla Denyer has not led them in a radical enough a direction for this guy to be getting quite a lot of support. So that's quite a significant leadership election, which I think should get more coverage in the media, actually. But the dynamics between them and the Corbynites is quite interesting because obviously I'm not sure how much campaigning Corbyn's done on the environment before, but obviously there is an attraction there. I mean, the main parties, if we can still call the Conservatives a main party after your devastating critique of my friend Kemi, my new friend Kemi. I've now moved from Mel Stride to Kemi.
Oh, you're so fickle. You're so fickle.
Well, no, I haven't. I still admire Mel, but I've got more fronts opening up against me now.
It's nice though that we've got balance on this podcast, because clearly you're the only Tory ever on it, Jim.
Laura Kunsberg, Mel Stride, and now Kemi. I'm having to defend all three on this podcast. But I just would make the other observation that we talk about sort of the Conservative Party collapsing, but the support for the right in this country is not collapsing, and it's having an effect on the Labour Party, who are moving in fits and starts, and we could discuss that if you want to, towards the right. I mean, this new thing over the weekend, foreign criminals to face deportation after sentencing. Labour is clearly getting a bit paralysed with fear of reform in its own way, and that could cause internal splits in the party as well.
Yeah, no, I don't think it would be fair to say that the Labour Party is in a healthy place at all. I think its poll ratings are sort of hovering around 22, 23, so still significantly behind reform. And Keir Starmer's popularity ratings or unpopularity ratings are startling. I think I was listening to commentary last week suggesting that it's the worst performance of any Labour Prime Minister at this stage of a parliament, and people already beginning to speculate whether he will be fighting the next election for Labour, as Prime Minister. So no question, Jim, the two major parties, if we can put it that way, are in real trouble. But it demonstrates the splintering of our politics and that lack of certainty and the lack of consistency in terms of the way in which policy is now developed. And perhaps we are, as a nation, getting what we deserve. We voted for Brexit. We rolled the dice on that. It's costing us £40 billion a year, and all the other benefits that we lost as a result of that particular decision. And then we do seem to be playing football manager with our politicians. We want this instant gratification. We want people to be able to sort out what are long-term problems within a year as far as the Labour government is concerned, and it's just not possible, which is why I go back to the statement I made earlier. At some point, somebody has to be straight with the British people. I think the point I'll make, and I'll bring Jo in to talk about her friend Nigel now, is that Nigel Farage is not the person to do that. And isn't it interesting that we talked on many occasions about what I think is the over coverage in the media of reform, and Sky News got a right good kicking for basically taking Farage's press conferences live, and they've now decided not to do that in the future. But more interesting to me was the fact that Farage was simply not answering questions that he didn't like. And I think that at some point we'll catch up with him, Jo. I know at the moment we all say he's this great communicator, he's got his finger on the pulse, but whenever he was asked a difficult question during those press conferences, he tried to do the Trump thing of, oh, that's nonsense, and he just can't get away with it. I don't think anybody can get away with it in the UK. No,
and I think, if you took Nigel Farage out of the reform equation, they wouldn't be anywhere near where they are. And he knows that. Because what you're now seeing, certainly here in Kent, they've now run the county council. They've already, the new reform leadership have had to write to Yvette Cooper asking for an increase in immigrant visas to support the people that are coming here to work in social care, because there's such a shortage and such a high demand. So there are all of those things playing out around the country, in various town halls and what have you, where you're seeing reform in action. The reason Sky News got into trouble for that press conference was because the, barely out of short trousers leader of whatever council it is went and proceeded to give a complete contempt of court on a rape case involving a 12-year-old girl and 2 men who've been arrested and charged. So, no broadcaster, as Jim and I would know, on pain of death, would ever do anything that is going to risk you having a contempt of court live broadcast. No, it'll be fine, said the reform managers. It'll be fine. No, we all understand contempt of court. Well, Nigel does, but whatever his name is, the small lad who runs whatever council it is didn't. And that's the sort of thing that makes them look incompetent. I mean, the other thing I think is that, interestingly, Ben Habib, who used to be deputy leader or chairman or something or other of Reform, has now set up another party. And guess who's signed up with him? One Tommy Robinson. So you've now got a deeply unpleasant liaison of people on the very far right. You've also got these groups called Homeland and various others. And I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that they are in any way connected to Reform or any other political party. But, Reform need to be careful. Nigel is extremely good and very eloquent at preparing a hand grenade, taking out the pin, passing it on to somebody else and walking away. And if that person he hands it to is stupid enough, they'll lob it. Otherwise, you can hold on to it. You don't have to throw it. And that's what they haven't learned yet. And I think, just to go back on the Greens thing, the Greens have had totally no coverage. When you think how much coverage dear Caroline Lucas used to get on her own as the only Green MP for all those years, the Green MPs have had no coverage. You barely see anything. And now the only coverage they're getting is an internal split as whether they stay moderate under Ellie Chowns and the other bloke, or whether they go, hard left or hard militant under Zach Polanski. And that will put up a lot of people. And of course, the party that is quietly soaking them up like a sponge is the Liberal Democrats, because they're taking people from Labour, they're taking people from the Tories, and they're taking people from the Greens. And I think what we're seeing is a complete reshape, albeit like a jelly mold. It's not very firm, but you've got everybody wants the extreme, whether they're right or left, Jeremy Corbyn or Nigel Farage or whoever they are, and everybody wants something now. And actually, it's a real shame, because Keir Starmer was perfectly equipped to be that grown-up politician and stand on the steps of Downing Street and say, I'll level with you. I mean, he did say it's going to get worse before it gets better. We didn't expect it to get quite so worse because of their own making. But, you've got to have those trade-offs and have those conversations. And none of the other parties are doing it.
Now, Sir Ed Davies had a good summer. And again, we'll touch upon the Lib Dems and the Tories in more detail next week. Just to finish on this final segment of the first part of this week's pod, can I just go back to Rachel Reeves' challenge and what we think she will do? And the other thing that people have started to agitate against is the net zero agenda of Ed Miliband's. And again, this isn't the right wing who are agitating against it. It's the trade unions, in particular Unite and the GMB, who are saying this absolute, determination to go for these net zero targets by 2030, economically a disaster, because it's going to cost jobs. And obviously the reduction in bills that we were promised isn't happening for all sorts of technical reasons that I won't get into now. In the meantime, one of the geopolitical left-wing champions, Lula in Brazil, has allowed BP to drill and find the biggest oil reserve that we've discovered in 50 years. And so, go back to your point earlier, Jim, oil prices are likely to come down further because we've got this glut of oil now in Brazil. And what people are saying is, why is little old Blighty going to be the only country that goes to COP30 in a few weeks' time, waving its green banner, when everybody else, Brazil included now, are saying drill, baby, drill?
Well, it's very difficult. There's two things here. One is the signals that are coming from, well, you mentioned Brazil. Obviously, the massive one is Donald Trump. To be fair to the Chinese, I believe they have begun to bear down on some of their emissions. But generally speaking, in the last few years, the trend has been sort of to double back on net zero. The only thing is that, the trade unions in this country or Trump or anybody else is, adopting the it's okay in my generation approach. Let's be comfortable while we're living, and hell with the future, because we were just talking earlier on in a joking fashion about the seas being 19 degrees. That will lead to bigger storms in this country and anywhere else. Yesterday, Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh went up in flames with a gorse fire, and we're seeing the catastrophic effects of climate change in southern Europe. It's starting to affect the holiday trade. People just don't want to go to 40, 45 degrees searing heat. Quite apart from the fact that in other parts of the world, the immigration issue is being accelerated by people who can't stand it anymore and can't get any food, and they're coming to the West. So, climate change is coming, and it's just a question of the short-term jobs, and so it is difficult. And Ed Miliband, I think Ed Miliband, in a fairly unpopular cabinet, is the most popular member because he seemed to be standing by what he believes.
Well, he's the most popular member amongst Labour supporters, Jim.
Important qualification.
He's not the most popular member across the country. In fact, I think he'd be probably hovering around Keir's numbers. But let me just push back a little, because I'm not suggesting in any way, shape or form that I disagree with your analysis of the climate emergency. The argument that you face from the people out there is, well, that's all well and good, but you've mentioned the man Trump. You've mentioned China, who, maybe doing a little bit around the edges at the moment, but they're still spewing out emissions at a rate that we could never even get to if we tried. Then, of course, you've got India, developing country, becoming more of an industrial base than it was previously. And as I say, the reason I mentioned Lula was he was seen as the left-wing green champion on this agenda. So for the fact for Brazil, and he's, by the way, he's also taken down half of the bloody forest that he said he was going to protect when the last lad, Barcelona, was chopping them down at a rate of knots. So the pushback, Jim, would be, why a little old UK trying to basically do this on the back of me and my cost of living crisis, when all these big countries are cracking on doing whatever they want? Are we going to be able to make any difference to the climate emergency as little old Blighty? That is the argument that you hear now on a regular basis from people, I'm afraid.
Well, we try and set an example. I mean, if we just sort of cave in and go along with drill, baby, drill, we're not setting an example. I mean, you can call it naive, stupid, whatever. No, you point up the realities, you point up the pressures that there are on the government, and it'll be interesting to see how Ed Miliband reacts if the government decide to accept some of these pressures to roll back on net zero, and what he does about it. But I suppose it's as simple as that. We must stand up for what we believe in.
I think he'd be either reshuffled, sacked, or resign, I guess, if they started to renege on any of those targets. But I think there's becoming a pressure point, even within the Labour Party now, Joe, as to whether or not these targets that have been set can be met. And of course, you're then starting to see some of the difficulties and challenges around very simple things like electric vehicle charges.
Well, exactly. Yeah,
lack of infrastructure and all those sort of things. 2030 is round the corner when it comes to stuff like this, yeah? Yeah,
exactly. And, it's fine to say, oh, well, what difference does it make? Well, it's a huge difference has been made in we don't all get plastic bags anymore, do we? We've actually managed to go back to how we used to and take shopping bags when we go shopping or pay for one. We don't, well, there is still quite a lot of littering, but we have got better. People clear up after their dogs. They didn't used to. They just used to leave it. So there are ways of making change. I think the problem with Ed Miliband is that he is like so many people who are very, quite rightly, and I agree with their aims, they can be very sort of hardline, preachy, and they don't make it possible for people to believe that doing little things can make a difference. And I think that's the problem. Every time you're talking about targets and you're talking about net zero, actually, sometimes you need to start locally and say, look, in the office, Can we not have plastic cups? Can we not have plastic bottles? It's little things like that. You know, schools do it because that's how you educate the next generation. You can do it in hospitals. You can do it in, you know, in places of work. And I know those sound like silly little things, and probably, you know, if there was a reform council, they'd ban it immediately. But those are the things that make people feel they're making a difference. And I'll just give you an example. Fair trade, coffee, sugar, etc. The people on the ground did the really hard work on getting those deals through. All we have to do is go to the co-op and buy it. But it was the people who were doing the hard work who then got the deals with the co-op and Tesco's and everybody else. That means that we just automatically buy fair trade, and then every now and again you think, oh, okay, that's interesting. And somehow or other, the whole environmental argument has got to be less doomsday and a little bit more about what we can do, because otherwise you think, oh, well, what the hell, I might as well go out in a ball of flames.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've come a long way from the Chancellor's challenges all the way through to net zero, and in between talked about Kemi the snitch. So I'm going to bring the first part of today's episode to a close before we get into the geopolitical situation that has emerged this week. Of course, Gaza continues to be in the news, and Ukraine is the end in sight, that particular conflict. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to today's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. So we've talked all things domestic in the first part of today's programme. Now we're going to turn our attention to international affairs, and let's start with Gaza. Some grotesque scenes continuing, of course, and overnight we hear of journalists, 5 journalists being killed in an attack by the IDF. So Netanyahu's charm offensive, if you can use that phrase as far as Netanyahu is concerned, in his press conference yesterday when he was basically denying that any Gazans were starving, when he basically doubled down and said that Israel are going to now take control of the whole of Gaza in order to protect Israel. In the meantime, more and more countries, former allies of Israel, well, countries that would still say they are allies of Israel, to be fair, are saying that they're going to recognise a Palestinian state. Joe, you are our resident expert in all things Middle East. Can you give us your reflections on what's happened over the past 48 hours?
Well, it's devastating. And one of the things that we have seen in the last few days is aerial footage of the destruction, the scale of destruction of Gaza. There is very little left, if anything at all. Netanyahu is doubling down. He wants to go in. He wants to flatten it. He talks blithely of, you know, moving the Palestinians to somewhere else like they're chickens to be rehoused. He's got no sense of them as human beings who have the same hopes, dreams, desires, fears and worries that every other human being on the planet has got. He's absolutely, you know, he's now beginning to sound even more bonkers by saying this is fake news, the pictures that we've seen of starving children. I mean, even after Trump in Scotland said that's not fake, it's really distressing. And all he wants to do is to hang on in part to avoid going to jail, because he surely will if he is tried in his own country for corruption. But what a cost in terms of humanity and international reputation and money and lives and everything else for a few bracelets, cigars and bottles of champagne. But Israel's got very strict rules on corruption. He's broken those rules. He's facing trial, but he won't go to trial because he, as Prime Minister, can keep delaying. The news that Anas al-Sharif, who's a very well-known Al Jazeera journalist, and 4 members of his production crew were killed in a direct hit by the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, is really shocking. And the IDF are saying, or Israel is saying, that he was a known link to Hamas. Well, you know, they could say that about the man on the moon, frankly, because all they're doing is justifying indiscriminate killing. And the most interesting thing, I think, is that 600 former security and military advisors said to Netanyahu, do not go ahead with the complete razing of Gaza. It's ridiculous. It will be a war that goes on forever. I'd like to see countries around the world do a little bit more than say they'll recognize the state of Palestine and condemn Israel, and start by boycotting Israeli goods. Stop trading with Israel. It's not just about arms, it's about all sorts of things, and really start doing it, because the Israeli people don't want this. I mean, his approval ratings are appalling, but they've got no way out. And meanwhile, the death and horror continues.
Do you see any end in sight, Joe? Because we were saying last week, weren't we, that America's tone seemed to have changed. But then over the past 7 days, Netanyahu has simply dug in. So it doesn't appear that Trump or the American administration are putting any pressure, or putting Netanyahu under any pressure. Indeed, one of, I can't remember the guy's name who went from the American government, but he's been and he's back. And as I say, no progress appears to have been made.
No. There's no progress. There's no, I mean, there may well be some diplomatic activity. And last week, I think there was a little bit of hope. We spoke about it, that the Arab countries were getting together to try and, say we will support Palestine, and therefore they would work with the nations that would recognize a Palestinian state. No. And of course, with America, Trump's got the attention span of a lighthouse. He's now focused on Putin. So he's forgotten what's going on in Israel. I mean, there are shocking stories about Netanyahu that have been chronicled over the decades. He is an appalling man, but until he goes, nothing will change. And the only way out of it is, and I think Lord Malek Brown was saying the other day on an interview, you can't treat Hamas as an army. They're not an army. So you've defeated them. They're a group of people. But, now you're recruiting for them, aren't you? For generations to come. No, I mean, Israel doesn't listen to the UN, doesn't listen to the aid agencies, doesn't listen to international opinion, doesn't listen to, so the only way to do it is to hit them and boycott, so that it actually hits ordinary Israelis in their pockets and in their jobs and everything else. I don't feel hope.
No, Jim, get your reflections on what's happening in the Middle East, but then, if you will, go on to the developments in terms of this summit that is going to take place, we're told, on Friday in Alaska between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
Yes, very briefly on the Gaza situation. I wrote in my blog this week about the Arab countries need to step up and offer an alternative, which involves the expulsion of Hamas and then vast investment in Gaza. Just one last thing, I commend to you, I think it'll be a report on TV tonight. Jeremy Bowen has been in the West Bank, seeing the accelerated aggressive action by Jewish settlers there. One is forced to conclude that they do want the Palestinian people to leave both the West Bank and Gaza. And, that seems to be what they're determined to do at the moment, but they're facing increasing internal opposition. And I think that eventually, an Arab initiative assuring Israel that there will be no security issues, recognize Palestine in Gaza, and then try and sort out something for the West Bank. But none of it's all impossibly difficult. Moving on to the Ukraine thing, I've got two major questions, and I'm really interested in what you guys think about this. Surely Donald Trump would not have agreed to or tried to organize a meeting with Vladimir Putin unless he was assured that Putin was going to make some sort of concession. Surely Trump will not want to go to it. This is what I think could easily happen. Go to Alaska and be humiliated by Putin, who will come there saying, I want all the territory I've conquered, and by the way, I want a passive government in the rest of Ukraine. I want elections where a sort of a Russian puppet can be elected, and never join the EU, never join NATO. That's what I guess Putin will go there with. So that's my first big question. So are we to conclude that Putin is going to make some sort of ceasefire and promise to do things? So that's one thing I'd like your views on. The second thing is that, of course, we've seen the European countries reacting to the possibility that Vladimir Zelensky will not be present at the Alaska talks, although there's talk of him going now, and preparing their own position. And if that's to be the case, the European countries have got to finally grapple this situation, because the only way I could see Vladimir Zelensky agreeing to surrender 20% of his country is if he is immediately made a member of NATO and is given all the guarantees that that involves as to the integrity of his country against a revived Russia who would be wanting to start the war again. So those are my two issues. But the first one really troubles me. I can't believe that Trump wants to leave even the possibility. I mean, I know he would say, well, I tried to deal with this man and he's completely unreasonable. But what does he do then? I mean, the optics of Trump not getting anything out of Putin in Alaska seem to be something he would never want to get into.
I'd be pleasantly surprised if Putin was to give Trump anything. Because I don't think he needs to. I think they're in a very strong position as far as the conflict is concerned. Putin, of course, has got his own domestic politics to worry about, so he can't be seen to be giving any concessions. My view of this, I've felt this for a long time, is when Trump used to say, I'll end this war in a day, it was basically on the basis that he'd get Ukraine to surrender. And I think in the early days of his presidency, we saw some of that, didn't we, play out, because he stopped providing weapons and he stopped all sorts of other support that was being given. Now, I'm not quite sure what's happened in the States, but clearly there were voices within and without his administration in America who said, whoa, you're going too far here. You know, this guy is going to take the whole of Ukraine. We can't allow that to happen. And so the most recent statement he's made as far as the conflict was concerned is putting a 50% tariff on India because India continued to buy Russian oil. So he's been, it's like this on many an issue, of course, but he's been all over the place, Joe, on Ukraine. My guess is that he just wants to be seen to be in a room with Putin. It's the next episode of the series The Orange Madman in the White House. And and Jim's just made the point himself. You know, he will say if he gets any concessions, he'll treat that as a success. If he doesn't, he'll just say, well, Putin's a nutter and we can't get anything out of him and we can't continue to fund this war. So Zelensky, you know, back over to you.
Yes, I mean, personally, I think it's disgusting that they could even consider having talks without Zelensky being there. It's appalling on so many levels, and Trump could be pushing for that. I think Jim's point about, you could fast track, well, it wouldn't be a fast track because they've been on a waiting list for a long time, get Ukraine into NATO, which would require America to say, yes, we won't block it. Now, would Trump be prepared to do that? And then say to Zelensky, all right, that's what we'll do, but you've got to cede, the areas that they've already taken, like Crimea and all the rest of it, to Russia. I don't think he's nuanced enough, and I don't think he's strategic enough. I think Putin's played him along, and I've said that from the outset. I think he's begun to see it, but, he wouldn't be going to Alaska or setting up this meeting unless he thought there was something in it for him, not America, but for Donald Trump, himself. So who knows what Putin might offer. I mean, it may not even happen. It is quite possible that, it's all talk, smoke and mirrors, and that suddenly there'll be some security alert or something that means it doesn't happen. Meanwhile, Putin will continue bombing Ukraine, and the death and destruction continues in Gaza. And Trump looks even weaker. He's failed on the Middle East, he's failed on Ukraine. Meanwhile, at home in America, food prices are going through the roof and people are beginning to feel rather unhappy with the dollar in their pocket.
What we have stopped talking about is Jeffrey Epstein. So, the cynic within me says, well, what was the big story that Trump could break this week? Oh, I'm going to meet Vladimir, my old pal. Jim, sorry, I interrupted.
No, I just want to follow up what you've said. I mean, you put a thought in my mind that, he actually gets nothing from Putin in terms of Ukraine, that Putin takes a hard line and Trump comes away from it with right. I'm telling you, you've got to to the Ukrainians. I'm going to bring peace. I'm going to go for that Nobel Prize because I brought a ceasefire. But you've got to concede 20% of your territory. But Vladimir has agreed to a lot of trade deals with the United States, and we're going to, make America great again. I mean, you've put that thought in my mind as to why he would agree to this. It would be utterly cynical, but you could just see him saying, "Well, I brought peace to Ukraine," and the Ukrainians saying, "Oh, but that's only a temporary. Don't talk to me about that. Let's move on." And I've also got trade deals which help the United States people with their trade with Russia. You've just put that thought into my mind as to why he's walking into what otherwise I see as a cul-de-sac.
I think the other thing you have to remind ourselves is that I think it was Vance who said that he wouldn't support. I think I'd have to check this. I'm sure Vance said he wouldn't support Ukraine joining NATO. And certainly there are many Republicans who are more sympathetic to Russia, saying that Europe and NATO under the Biden administration, other Democrat administration, tweaked the tiger's tail, and that Ukraine should never have been seen as a potential NATO member, and certainly not a member of the European Union. So that would be the alternative argument. They will be saying to Ukraine, forget joining NATO, forget joining the EU, get back in your lane. You're going to be seen basically as a neutral country, as the barrier between the rest of Europe and Russia. But there is no way that Putin is going to concede the land grab that he's already taken, because how does he justify that to the Russian people? He's lost millions of people, millions of Russian troops have lost their lives. He's not going to say, oh, well, okay, Donald's kicked off now, so here you go, Zelensky, have Crimea back. And yeah, it's just not going to happen, Joe, is it? So
No.
I sadly think that whatever plan that Trump has in his head, it's simply going to be something whereby he can tell a story of an American win. He don't really give two monkeys about Ukraine, does he?
No, he doesn't. And he's jolly lucky he's not travelling with Kemi the snitch, because she would, stitch him up and call him out for all the lies he's told. No, he doesn't give a damn about Ukraine. He doesn't give a damn about Gaza. If he can get something out of it, whether it's, Gaza, the Riviera on the Mediterranean, or if he can get something out of, but he signed the deal with Ukraine on rare earths, which aren't that rare, but he's got that deal on the mining and the excavation stuff. Putin has played him all along, and I would not be surprised if the meeting doesn't not go ahead. And you might be absolutely right, Frank, you old cynic, that it could have all been smoke and mirrors to stop us talking about Epstein. Let's see where Ghislaine Maxwell ends up, in a very, very low security prison back in this country, perhaps.
Maybe. And as you say, Kemi the snitch might have something to say about that, mightn't she? So we'll keep our eye on that particular story. Let's just sort of draw a line under this conversation by saying, I think that if the summit does take place on Friday, I think we'd all agree Zelensky needs to be in the room, as do other European leaders. And in fact, it's interesting that more and more voices from Europe coming out today as we speak, actually, as we've been recording the podcast, saying Europe needs to have a voice in terms of any deal that is done. And so let's see what develops. Let's see if, as you say, Joe, that the meeting goes ahead at all. But sadly, between all three of us and the international community seem to be in the same place. No end in sight at all to those appalling the appalling situation that we've seen emerge in Gaza, and I don't think anybody is anticipating an end to that anytime soon, which is really it's tragic beyond words when you see some of the pictures that are coming out of Gaza. So, okay, we're going to draw the podcast this week to a close. Sorry to depress you on this Monday, but very serious issues, and we can't pretend that they're not happening, and we can't put a positive spin on it, I'm afraid. Let's see what the next 7 days bring. In particular, let's hope that something positive comes from those talks, or planned talks, between Trump, Putin, and hopefully Zelensky. It's been great to have your company, guys, and I know that Jim's off now to do something exciting on this Monday morning, and Joe, you're going into the sea. It's
I am.
90 degrees.
I know. I'm going to be looking for Jim's octopus, so to speak. Is
Right. Well, Joe's off to look for Jim's octopus. Jim's off. I don't know where. What are you doing, Jim? Are you doing anything interesting in Cornwall?
No, I'm having to return to Bristol imminently now.
Oh, okay. Well, safe travels, and we will see you again same time next week. But of course, in the meantime, we'll not only have you got the pleasure of listening to our thoughts on all of the key issues that have been happening over the past 7 days and the next 7, but you've got that podcast that I've recorded with Dame Louise Ellman to look forward to. That will be out tomorrow. So please tune in for that, because, as I say, a fascinating story from a fascinating woman. Been great to have your company again. Thanks very much for listening. See you all next week.